I'm honored today to present to you Sasaki's revitalization of Raleigh's Moore Square, what I'm calling the Grove's third century. I first came to know Raleigh through an exhibition I co-curated with my colleague Laura Moret, who's sitting in the audience at Northeastern a few years ago, called Emerald Networks, Reviving the Legacy of City Parks. Laura and I and Sasaki really wanted to look at cities that were endowed with these extraordinary legacy park systems and understand how are they adapting and evolving these for the 21st century. And it was here we came to start thinking about the city of Raleigh. We posited that in this exhibition that there were three basic kinds of park systems, these legacy systems, starting from the right, the axial relationships you might think about from places like Chicago or Washington, D.C., rings that follow hydrologic systems, such as the chain of lakes in Minneapolis or Boston's Emerald Necklace, and square systems, those like Philadelphia, Savannah, and of course Raleigh. And our exhibition really looked at both the advantages that those systems bring, but also the challenges. We looked across 7 cities across the United States and really tried to understand how were 21st century concerns being addressed in park planning and how were specific projects kind of advancing those ideals within a kind of legacy and cultural framework. I was thinking to myself that if this were an evening series, we could have a drinking game every time the Christmas plan came up. I don't know that I can add anything except to say the Christmas plan was certainly part of our study of Raleigh and understanding the 5 squares, the 2 that exist today without buildings, and the central square on the ridgeline. We also investigated how Raleigh was growing and changing, understanding where it sat among its peers in terms of acreage of park space, spending on park space, and understanding the kind of pressures exerted on this landscape, the broader public system landscape. And so meeting growing demands as population climbs, growth and change at the same time across the region, very much the foundation of this conference today. How do we take memory and culture as part of that evolution and growth? Quote here by Mitchell Silver, the planning director here and our client for the downtown plan, who you'll hear from shortly, recognizing that the role of public parks is changing in downtowns, that parks are the living rooms for many downtown residents. Sasaki was privileged to work on that downtown plan with Planning Director Silver at the time, really starting to identify opportunities to grow this system, to think about the squares as you see here, Nash and Moore as the 2 kind of dominant public spaces, and thinking about how to evolve this 18th century model into something that was much more 21st century. So that was really about connectivity, mobility enhancements to really connect the squares to the emerging greenway system, thinking less of the parks as actually individual moments in time, and instead a system of open spaces that were all connected to each other. At the same time, the city was undertaking a competition, an international design competition, to look at Moore Square, knowing that it was a priority. This competition was won by Chris Count's studio, who produced an incredible set of ideas about Moore Square, and that those were then furthered through a community-driven master plan vision, and this was the foundation of the work we were to do. But what Chris did in his master plan was first keep the heritage oaks, second, establish a kind of dignified landscape of urban frame and sidewalk and edge. Third, create a kind of centralized open space to Moore Square for performance and gathering. And then infusing, this is really a new idea, this is bringing new kinds of program to this historic square, which typically would be a crisscross with a monument in the middle, but bringing into it fountains and play spaces and a concession building, so things that would really cater to a growing residential downtown population. At the same time, contemplation of change was happening for the square itself. The downtown was also forecasting the change that would happen around the square. So here we are looking at the square from above, soft sites at the edges that we could foresee redevelopment strategies, opportunities for new mobility improvements around the square's edges, and connectivity to some of that urban fabric that, like many things in Moore Square's recent history, had become eroded or kind of lost or invisible over time. Moore Square kind of rose to the top of every planning list, so from the downtown plan to the park system plan completed around the same time to as far back as the 2003 Livable Streets plan, Moore Square was always at the top of the list because it has this really central place in memory and identity and had really in many ways fallen on some hard times. Stephen talked about the issues of people experiencing homelessness in this landscape, but in addition, as we've heard, there was just a sort of incremental change over time that had left a landscape of monuments and fountains fountains and trinkets and ornamental planting and circulation systems that were really rogue, that started to cut through and eat this landscape and really do damage to the heritage oaks. And so you can see why this sort of rose to the top of the list in terms of priorities in an emerging district with more growth in population. It similarly had this kind of very common sad tale of downtown urban parks, where it was a boom and bust cycle of programming, where there would be these massive events on the weekend, huge crowds, the soils and the trees would take the brunt of it, and then it would disappear and it would go fallow for a week or two until the next big event. And so part of our charge was, how do we think about this landscape in a new way to invite everyday use consistent with the residential population and spare the sort of damage and cycle of repair that was happening again and again. Okay, so I want to shout out to my incredible design team, because they're all extraordinarily lovely individuals and we had a great time working on this project, but also because one of the things that I've really learned being a board member for the Cultural Landscape Foundation is how necessary it is to have many different kinds of perspectives at the table when looking at a cultural landscape. So I led the design effort along with my partner Zach, who's an engineer. He led an infrastructural team that was really Kimley Horn and Dewberry and Sasaki, looking at infrastructure systems and utilities and all of the stormwater issues, which were immense. Eamon Hutton, who's a project landscape architect who probably, like me, has dirt on his shoes from our walk through the square yesterday. Christine, an architect at Sasaki, who helped us look at the urban frame and the facilities that line it, as well as future opportunities in a sensitive way of infusing architectural pavilions into this landscape in the future. Bree and Stephen were the planner and urban designer for the downtown plan. They stayed on to help us translate this work that had been done in the downtown plan, thinking about the role of this place in the city and the district, into a physical place. We had Candace and her team from HR&A looking at governance and operations and programming. How do we diversify the way this place is used so that it's not this cycle of boom and bust? I can't even, with Mary Ruffin Hainberry and Charles Birnbaum, they were such important players on this team. Mary Ruffin from Hainberry Preservation giving us a deep dive into Raleigh's culture and history and really helping us through the process of working through a cultural landscape. And Charles kind of every step of the way pushing us to see things that maybe others hadn't seen or that we didn't see in terms of the cultural landscape here. Barrett looked at the soils, helped us to replenish and recover those, while Bartlett Tree really helped us to understand the heritage oaks. And then last but not least, we don't get this opportunity on every project, but we had Kofi Boone and Brad Goldberg to help us with art and heritage. And so Brad Goldberg, a stunning artist who was with us from day one through the whole process, and Kofi Boone, who really helped us to think about the relationship of this landscape to other heritage systems at play. So we also had, on top of all this, extraordinary leadership from Mayor McFarland, who you met this morning, and Diane Sauer, the Parks Director, but I would be remiss without acknowledging my Stephen Bentley and Grayson Mon, who, as the client representative, were really core to this team. And so I celebrate this team for seeing and understanding this landscape together and leading to the story I'll tell you in a moment. So the story of Moore Square, in my mind, is a love story between the city market and the Grove. So the Grove is this extraordinary oak canopy, some of them over 100 years old. People think very fondly about coming to this place and joining with friends and family. They don't call it Moore Square, they call it the Grove for a very specific reason. And we heard about this again and again, that this was a place in even segregated Raleigh where races would mix, where people would come together, and that's so core to what this place is. So both the master plan and our effort at Sasaki was to look really carefully at those trees, at those heritage oaks, understand their disposition, their health, how we could protect them in the future. You can see they roughly form a frame. We wanted to actually fill the frame in and make it a successional planting strategy of more oaks at the edges, diversify that oak canopy and grow it, but also protect what's there. This is the market. It sits on the south side of our park. And again, a place even in segregated Raleigh where everyone came together to shop, to participate in produce, as you see here. Charles helped us to see something I don't think many people would see, that the eastern portico of this building, this big gracious portico, actually center-lined on the center line of Moore Square. A visual and symbolic connection that had been completely eroded, just through incremental change over time without acknowledgement of that important visual axis. So we really carefully surveyed the frame to understand where were those significant historic view sheds and facilities that we really needed to preserve, and this sort of helped us to adapt the plan and grow it as we moved into physical design. We also had this incredibly deep community conversation. We actually, in City Market, spent a week, what we called Power Week, where we hunkered down and had community members come at all times of the day and night. We did tours of Moore Square. We asked people about programmatic needs now and in the future. And we had focus groups with really every constituency group we could imagine to sort of get that engagement and get the understanding of where this place could grow and how it could change in a way that was consistent with both need but also heritage. And this is the resultant plan. So some of the kind of key ideas, this kind of preservation of the historic circulation system, a clarifying and opening up of the center of this space to really enable more flexibility and view, the preservation and enhancement of the oak frame and really limiting access to that oak frame to give those trees a better chance. And then the consolidation of really a lot of these introduced amenities, the cafe building, play spaces, a plaza, a fountain, to the southeast corner of the plan to really enable a kind of front porch that took advantage of solar aspect, but also that didn't block any of the historic important circulation or view sheds. So looking carefully at the oak frame, understanding its root system, protecting that zone to really enable those trees to thrive, instilling this dignified frame, as you see on the sidewalk. Sort of today it's a haphazard connection. We wanted to formalize that into a seat wall, really make the sidewalk kind of rise to the level of civic grandeur of the scale itself, and a new planting strategy to really kind of enhance that edge as a no-walk zone, a place for the trees. So here you see that at play, a kind of stone seat wall that lines the edges of the park, this planter rail that really protects those trees, these gracious gateways that lead you in, and then in the distance you see the cafe and concession building, which is sort of out of the way of these historic circulation patterns and views. The circulation pattern was something we really struggled with. Charles at one point said to me, if there's not an X on this plan, I can't be associated with it. This is the cultural lifeway of this place. And so we worked really hard to understand why that was so important, that this is the reading of a square in a town, and that centralized spine, as you see, connecting back to that portico of City Market to the south was also part of that kind of core connection. You see also that we have noted here historically Black Main Street and the South Park Heritage Walk, which were also two important layers of heritage that we were really thinking through how to introduce, and that's being manifest now actually in work that's being sort of described as we speak to inscribe heritage messages at each threshold into each corner of the park. So again, this kind of gracious diagonal circulation pattern, respected, sort of off-kilter slightly from the perfect X so that we can enable a greater physical lawn space to really accommodate the needs of the growing community. And again, you see kind of things pushed off to the side to really give a sense of graciousness and openness. Thinking about programming, how do we move away from boom and bust? And so here, really working with HRNA and thinking about all of the different kinds of community gathering that is essential to the thriving life of downtown Raleigh. And also multiple scales of events, much smaller day-to-day events that could be facilitated by the Parks Department, everything from kind of 100-person gospel groups to 20-person book clubs to much larger gatherings on an intermittent basis. Again, it's about welcoming diversity and inclusion and bringing more members of the community to this place more often. And so you see that kind of open lawn as this platform for that kind of space. You see off to the left the Pavilion Building, which becomes this porch overlooking the lawn. So trying to build in spaces of different scales to really enable this evolving life of Raleigh to take place. And then I just want to end on a few slides that talk about material quality. So another idea that came up through the process with Charles and with Mary Ruffin was the idea, how do we relate these three squares to each other? Right now, you could never tell that one was actually connected to another in terms of heritage tourism, kind of cultural lifeway issues. And so as we began documenting this landscape in physical form and materiality, we looked closely to the other squares to understand what was at play that we could sort of build off of. So here, the stonework of the Capitol building really became, and on the left are the precedent images, on the right are our construction documents. So translating that stonework into a new, more modern form, but materially connecting these two landscapes. At the Raleigh City Cemetery, falling in love with this exposed aggregate central spine with these cobble set edges. This became the motif really for the centralized spines of Moore Square, enabling permeability and accessibility and a unifying language that again ties it to other heritage landscapes in the area. At the Christ Church next to the Capitol building, a wrought iron fence, and this was a sort of inspiration to us as we thought through our planter rail. Again, material quality. We brought our scale way down so it was more welcoming, but really relying on its kind of structure as an inspiration for our rail. And lastly, even things like the details of the pin and feather work in the stonework at the Capitol building and around it as an inspiration for how to think about our skateboard deterrence. So maybe no one's ever going to know that that's what inspired the skateboard deterrence, but in our minds that was a really wonderful nod to this local craft. So I end here on a slide of the Martin Street sidewalk, which we've eliminated parking, and it'll be a wide, 30-foot wide promenade and a linear plaza. And the idea here is that the market, the love story, gets reunited on the southern edge of the park, that the market spills over and becomes part of the sidewalk, once again kind of symbolically connecting people to this heritage and to the site. And I wanted to just make a nod to something that Charles said at his LAF summit. I started with an exhibition, and I'll end with one, but this one is the Man in Nature exhibition curated by Professor Fine and written about in the 1972 Landscape Architecture magazine. Professor Fine, as Charles quoted, and now I quote you, sir, said, "A denial of history is a denial of the civilized mandate to constantly re-examine what we have done in terms of what we are and what we want to become." He, in his surveys of students found that landscape architecture, the least important skill was actually an understanding of the past, which was disheartening to say the least. Professor Fine said, "It had not been yet accepted by this profession that it's part of a historic stream, that history is everything that happened up until a minute ago." And so through all of this sort of scalar exploration of Moore Square, from understanding its role in the district to understanding its role in the city, the park, all the way down to its material quality, we hope people, and its programmatic overlay, we hope people that come to this new place see themselves through this landscape as part of that historic stream, and that our work is actually influenced by it and will influence it further down the line. So I invite you, my colleagues are touring 2 downtown tours this weekend at Moore Square, so you can join Eamon Hutton, Laura Moret, and Brianna Outlaw as they showcase the construction work at Moore Square, fully underway as you see here, our tree protection and the foundations of the building going in. And I invite you to come back in the spring of 2019 to actually experience the new Moore Square. So thank you.